Done.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining this academic counseling session for Block 3, Unit 4. And we'll be discussing today regarding the role of innovation in indigenous knowledge systems and IPR in reviving role of cultural dimensions in resource management and conservation. So how indigenous knowledge is significant for resource management and conservation, and what are the lacunas, what are the pros and cons of indigenous knowledge systems, that we'll be discussing today, and how IPR can help in reviving these cultural dimensions and incorporating them in resource conservation. So outline of my presentation will be why indigenous knowledge is important and how it became important again, how it has gained its revival, and what are the objectives, what is indigenous knowledge in its literal meaning and in its practical sense, and how this local or indigenous knowledge is a science or not. Is this, if you call this knowledge a local knowledge, or will you be able to interpret and decipher science? And I'll quote some examples related with indigenous knowledge from fishing background, from ship management and cattle management, and how to assess indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and what are the various studies which have been done to integrate indigenous knowledge in a scientific background and in scientific context, and how we can go for investigations into local knowledge whenever we have to take up some kind of research activity, and what kind of IPR issues are involved in conserving of indigenous knowledge and utilizing them for the larger benefit of natural resource conservation and management. So it became important again because there have been many projects which were implemented on totally on scientific studies and totally on the basis of scientific knowledge, and when they became ineffective, and when there was failures observed in sustainable ecological projects based completely on scientific knowledge, people started to appreciate the indigenous knowledge background which the local people were having. And there were people who were having ignorance about the intimate knowledge of the environment, and there were people who were having deep knowledge about the environment where they were living for generations. So when these aspects were identified, that people who are living in that environment can better manage that niche or that local environment rather than the people who have scientific knowledge of it, then the importance of indigenous knowledge came into picture. And there is significance given to this in Western science. And because earlier indigenous knowledge was considered superstitious and ignorant science, but now importance has been given, and through studies it has been established that it is also a kind of science in its basic essence. And how industrial technology helped in the process of development, and why, because the industrial technology was taking a larger contribution in the process of development. But when we started replacing or modification of nature, like in forestry, also in timber management projects, when the modification resulted in larger havoc in the environment, people realize that not just science can benefit the environment, we have to take care of, incorporate the concepts of indigenous knowledge as well. So towards the end of the 20th century, when Western scientific technology failed in many projects of forestry management and timber management projects, it was identified and realized that indigenous knowledge plays a very large role in conserving these natural resources. So then again, there have been few incidents like inability of British Petroleum to plug the hole in the undersea oil fields. And there was immense damage that was caused on the Gulf Coast of the USA for 3 months. Then we all know about the climate change, about the kind of changes which are being brought up in our environment due to sudden climatic changes, and the change in temperature, the change in climatic occurrences at any area. For example, in Jaipur, which was considered to be a drought prone area, now you can even hear of floods occurring in those areas. In Cherrapunji, where there was so much of rain, now the level of monsoon and the level of rain has decreased in those areas. So these kind of changes, which are very evident in our immediate environment and which we can witness in our daily lives, are helping us to identify that only scientific knowledge cannot give a solution to our immediate problems, and we have to take care of our environment through the indigenous knowledge, which was earlier ignored. So then there is also a loss of political domination of the Euro-American countries. Like earlier it was thought of that these countries will be dominating the entire world because the kind of scientific knowledge and the kind of technology background they have, they will be able to manage and conserve all their natural resources, and they'll play a bigger role in giving an example for the countries all over the world how to manage their resources. But when they failed, and the countries like China, Japan, Korea, and India as well, which is a kind of developing nation, they have been managing their resources in a better manner than the Euro-American countries considered developed. So the indigenous knowledge which we are incorporating into our systems has played a better role in managing our resources in spite of the population burden, and then in spite of the constraints of technology we have still at a better position in managing our natural resources. So those kind of examples have told these countries and the scientific community that indigenous knowledge cannot be ignored any longer. And again, philosophical revolution of the 20th century, and there have been many deconstructionist and most postmodern theories are there, which have led to the transformation in science, and which have realized all the scientists that only the quantum theory and relativity cannot give solution to all kind of environmental problems. So again, we'll be discussing more examples like that. And you can see here the pictures of 5 years after British petroleum spill, and new rules for offshore drilling aim to boost society. This is one of the leading news items from Los Angeles Times. And more on April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded, and 11 people were killed in the nation's most worst environmental disasters. And many sea pelicans, they were totally covered in oil, and there was a major havoc to all the living flora and fauna in the ocean region. Then we have this ozone hole discovery. In 1985, a hole in the ozone hole layer was discovered in Antarctica. And in 1987, after the Montreal Protocol was signed, the hole reached to an area of 22.4 million square kilometers, and ozone concentrations dropped to 109 Dobson units. So this is again a picture which shows how this ozone hole has expanded over the years, and there has been so much drop in ozone at the in the area around the ozone hole. And I think you must be knowing that ozone is measured in Dobson units. So now by 2006, the worst year of ozone depletion was there. But now it has a revival in the concentration of ozone has been seen, and we have stabilized the position of ozone hole. And we hope that with continuous non-usage of ozone depleting or chemicals and substances, we'll be able to stop and mitigate the disaster of ozone hole, which has already been caused in Antarctica and Arctic area. So what are we going to learn? So we are going to compare Now, after realizing why indigenous knowledge became important after so many years of industrial revolution and development and technological advancement, we are again moving towards indigenous knowledge. Why is it so? Then when we have realized that it is important, then we can compare why, what is the difference between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge, what are the benefits of both and what are the drawbacks of both, and then cross-cultural perspectives, what in the application of indigenous knowledge. Sometimes in some contexts it has been seen that indigenous knowledge is not completely helping in environment conservation. It sometimes creates a socio-cultural belief which hampers the environmental conservation. So those kind of examples will be discussed, and then viability, sustainability, and capacity for transformation of local knowledge systems, and what is the role of innovation and indigenous knowledge systems, as well as the intellectual property rights in reviving this cultural dimension in resource management. So indigenous knowledge, as you can see, it is a combination of two words, indigenous and knowledge. And if you see the literal meaning of indigenous and knowledge, you will be completely able to identify with the context we are talking about. So indigenous is basically about the people who are actually living in that area right from the beginning. Okay, so earlier when significance started to be given to indigenous knowledge, it gained a political picture, because many people thought that this is a movement which is starting to give early settlers in any place a distinguished position or a distinguished place in the society. But it was not the case. So black people, when conquered by white, a semantic and conqueror, and from the point of view of the West, they saw that it is between them and the black people or the indigenous people or the local people. So they never thought it is about the knowledge. It is about the ingraining those concepts of knowledge systems into our technology and scientific systems, so that we can create a better world. So if that would have been the objective and perspective when this indigenous knowledge system started getting significance, then till now we would have achieved a much better industrial development, rather than based on technology or scientific. It would have been a in totality, we would have taken best of both the worlds of scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So originally the authors like B.K. Roy Burman, who have written books on indigenous knowledge, they experts on tribal people, because again tribal people have been living in that area in a specific niche in that any country, and they have a notion of dispossession, and they felt that these indigenous people thought that they are being dominated, and thus the tribes of India can also be called as indigenous because of the intellectual, social, and economic marginalization they are suffering. Because if we take the example of the West, where black people were marginalized and they were dominated, so again in India we can see the tribal people are like in that context indigenous people. So many, but otherwise if we see, there are many terms used for indigenous knowledge. We can call it local knowledge or autochthonous knowledge, and we can designate what does not fall within the range of formal scientific knowledge. That can also be called indigenous knowledge. So dictionary meaning, if you see, autochthonous is inhabitant of a place. So indigenous, rather descendant from migrants or colonists. So in geology also, if you see, it is a kind of deposit or a formation present in its present position. So the position where it originally occurred, it is still lying there. That is called autochthonous. So there have been summarizations about this concept by Antwiller also, where they have considered the semantic stress or the meaning that they convey as the indigenous knowledge. Okay, so these are different kind of concepts which have emerged from indigenous knowledge. So indigenous knowledge is culturally specific, self-contained knowledge. So it is, or it is from concerned with the origin of a particular location, particular place, and it is defined in relation to the Western scientific knowledge. So it is in complete contrast with Western scientific knowledge, and it can help us identify more related systems of knowledge, like local knowledge, which is a skill or knowledge related to a specific place, or which implies limited wider relevance. Then autochthonous knowledge, which is of internal origin or culturally integrated. Then sustainable knowledge, where environment wisdom in tandem with indigenous knowledge provides sustainable solutions. Then community knowledge is also there, where maybe people are not living in that place right from their first generation, but they started sharing knowledge. And when they started sharing knowledge, they started and that knowledge came to their rescue. They started broadly disseminating that knowledge, and it gained much significance for their community as community knowledge. So what is a questioning about indigenous knowledge? It is like power hierarchy. So originally it was thought of, it is kind of a tussle between Western world and the marginalized group, but it is not the case, which has now been identified, that we should appreciate it as a knowledge. We should appreciate it as a local science. So these forms of knowledge are opposed to the state-sponsored knowledge, and people in power are reluctant to acknowledge that their knowledge was not sufficient or efficient. So people who are already in game, who have been playing the part of as a technocrat or as a scientist for years and generations, they are not ready to still to accept that their knowledge has failed, and they have to ingrain some indigenous knowledge system into their scientific knowledge to get in totality a solution for any local problem or any local environmental challenge. For example, scientific forestry. So in scientific forestry, if you see, European eco-label was there to identify what are the different processes which should be there for scientific forestry, and how mass scale afforestation and deforestation can be done on a continuous cyclic manner to get maximum profits and advantage from timber plantations and forestry plantations. But now the people have felt that this hard science is basically a reductionist, disciplinary, and hypothetically deductively derived understanding, while soft science, which is indigenous knowledge, is inductively derived knowledge from the experience you have in that ecosystem. So if you are inductively deriving some knowledge which is coming to you through the ecosystem itself, and then gaining through that experience and using that experience in making future projects work in a better manner, so it will be good for the ecosystem. So now science-based forest policy are changing their policies towards soft science, because at many places scientific forestry has failed, and the ecosystem in those places has not been able to be was not able to be conserved. Okay, so now they are moving towards indigenous knowledge systems. So these can be folk traditions transmitted orally or in the form of learning by experience, and the knowledge shared, for example, in farming shrimps in swamps. Now there are many communities living on seashores and living on river banks, which have been catching fish for generations, and still they are able to continue with their occupation without causing any damage to the ecosystem where they are living in. So that kind of indigenous knowledge is really being appreciated today, because they are earning, they are living, and they are deriving benefits from their ecosystem, and still they are continuing to protect it in a balanced manner. So the knowledge is implemented through traditional social organizations, like in Subak of Indonesia. Subak community is there in Indonesia, and they have identified these basic principles and how they can catch fish in high seas. We'll be discussing this further. So this Subak is the water management system for the paddy fields in Bali Island. Okay, so it was developed in 9th century, and the kind of pictures and studies I'm showing, the references of all these images, and the text has been given at in the last slide, and you can refer for more information to those references. So it is basically a water management and irrigation system. Like in India also, we have step farming. So there, but there the paddy is grown, but these kind of water harvesting structures are not formed. So this is one of its kind architectural innovation which rural people have devised in Indonesia, so that they can grow paddy in hilly areas and terraced fields carved out of the mountainside. So it's it's kind of engineering marvel in itself, but it is helping them in sustainable food production and landscape management as well. And they have been growing paddy in these areas for generations now, and it has been considered sustainable, because if it's if it's continuing for generations and generations, it's not causing any harm to the environment, and still it promises to be continuable for another generation. So again, we can consider this kind of technology or this kind of innovative mechanism for paddy and water harvesting in hilly areas as sustainable. So by understanding the kind of examples I am giving, you must be able to appreciate what are the benefits of indigenous knowledge. So it's a kind of local knowledge, but it is locally situated and it is locally applicable. Sometimes it may be applicable in similar kind of environment at some other place, but most of the times it is situated knowledge. It is not widely spread knowledge. And again, there is no systematic body who is propagating this kind of knowledge through media or through books or through other kind of channels. And then environmentalists or social workers project ingrain these local knowledge as antithesis of industrial knowledge. So antidote of industrial knowledge. So all that kind of havoc or all kind of mismanagement which has been caused by industrial knowledge can be protected or can be preserved through this kind of local knowledge or indigenous knowledge. So it is good for the environment and just and equitable also, because it helps in distribution of benefits to the environment as well as to the human society that is living there in an equal manner. Then there are some cons also. There are some drawbacks of indigenous knowledge, because it changes as per the value of society. So in my last lecture, if you have attended, we discussed what kind of socio-cultural beliefs are existing in our society. So those kind of society, socio-cultural beliefs, they change with the society. So human beings are not a product of culture, but culture is a product of human beings. So if we are the people, if we the people are going to make our culture, if we are going to make value system for our society, and that value system will keep on changing with times, because the kind of rituals which were there thousands of years ago, we used to do rituals on everyday basis. Now we do it on a 6 monthly, yearly basis, or on some specific occasions, specific significant occasions in our family. So you can understand the time dimension of these values. So if the society under consideration is both just and it is egalitarian, then the knowledge system will be implemented so as to maintain that. So again, if the society is hierarchical, so if there is caste system or there is slavery, then different kind of value systems will be there, and it will impact the subsistence. So these are some of the drawbacks of indigenous knowledge, because it keeps on changing with times. It keeps on changing with the values of society. So if the values of societies are balanced, in tandem with the needs of people as well as the environment, it will be good. But if it is, and these values are based on exploitation of one component or one portion of the society, then it won't be that beneficial. Then it can also create some kind of nuisance for the environment. So again, in Kelly Ellie's example, this study was also discussed in my last lecture, where she studied about the pollution of the Ganga and how these traditional modes and how the traditional values attached to the piousness of Ganga, holy nature of the river itself, were creating hurdle in its purification. Why? Because people think that this river, it can purify any kind of adulteration, it can purify any kind of external pollution that is induced into it. So if that kind of theory is there, then they will not be supportive enough to make any kind of change in the kind of effluent they are discharging, or the kind of pollution they are emanating from their local industries. If something is has power of purifying itself on regular basis and continuous basis, it won't get contaminated at any cost. But if that value keeps on propagating, then there cannot be any kind of study, or people will not support any kind of technology which can actually purify the river. So that was a hurdle that she realized during her study. And the rituals that sanctify the river have become so much commercialized under the new regime of sacred specialists, like people like pundits and all kind of people who were thriving near the ghats of Ganga. They have been doing these rituals for generations, and they won't give up the notion that the river can purify itself. But we have to tell them that this socio-cultural belief is no longer having any value because of the kind of stress that you have created on the river and the kind of self-power you have taken away from the river, because it is the threshold value that the maximum capacity or the carrying capacity of the river is no longer able to sustain itself without any external technology to purify it. So again, in the Hess in 1997, in her study of sheep management among an Indian community, these are some of the pictures of Indian communities. And Indian communities have been flocking sheep, and they are practicing their multiplication. So for generations. But when they keep on multiply these species among itself only, among the same flock for generations, their productivity decreases, and they kind of started having many kind of diseases, and many kind of infections started to happen in these flocks in Indian communities. So again, this is a kind of drawback of indigenous knowledge, where sometimes a scientific knowledge can help in creating a better sustainable solution. So these are some of the examples of studies. Like this is a statistical categorization of what kind of educational level of breeders was there, and how much the income generation was there, and what kind of what kind of diseases were being caused, and what was the frequency of their produces, what was the frequency of their employment. So many publications are there which have a decade of scientific studies has been done on these Indian communities and their sheep flocks, and they have identified what kind of diseases are prevalent these days and how solutions can be given to these local communities to counteract against those diseases and improve their flock production. So again, local knowledge is cognitive. It is kind of a shared perception is there. So these are kind of combinations of emotive as well as corporeal aspects. So based on the outside or specialist perception, like a scientist, the entire community is integrated with the emotional as well as the organizational aspects. Okay, so it is culturally situated and best understood as a social product. So now earlier we understood what is the indigenous knowledge. Now we are studying the second form of local knowledge. Then we'll refer to autochthonous knowledge, sustainable knowledge, and community knowledge. So after indigenous knowledge, we are concentrating on what is local knowledge. So local knowledge may not be as deep as indigenous knowledge, but it is culturally, again, it is culturally situated, and it is acquired to one's culture and is a part of inherited legacy. Okay. So it is a combination of emotional, organizational, as well as utility oriented activities and symbolic practices. Okay, so for example, sacred groves are there, which are preserved in many parts of our country also. These are examples of Ubango sacred groves in our country. So the sacred groves are preserved not only because of the abode of spirits. They think that there are some supernatural spirits which are thriving in these areas, and they need to be protected for their overall growth and uh, uh, survival of humanity. So these are tracts of virgin forest that are left untouched by the local inhabitants and are protected by the local people due to their cultural and religious beliefs. So these are very rich in vegetation, relic vegetation, the vegetation which has been there for generations, and the dominant flora in that area keeps on surviving due to this sacredness of these groves. So again, is local or indigenous knowledge a science? So it has concrete reality on one of its component. Thus, while there are many examples of fishing communities in our country, how they make boats and how they prepare their nets and their fishing rods, and what they are aware about all kind of life cycles of different fish species, the weather conditions. So this is the exact way in which a fisherman has to deal with the sea, and how this knowledge is now getting transferred from generation to generation. So even in some examples, when trained fishermen have traveled with local fishermen, they have seen how ingrained their knowledge is. Like they can whenever they catch their fish, they are able to identify which is the adda. Like adda is again a Hindi word. So where is the adda of those fish spawns, and where are the eggs laid, so that they don't harm that egg laying area, and they can catch the young fish, or at which life cycle which fish species is better harvested and has better commercial value. So all those aspects are there in the local knowledge of fishermen also. And in Nudisen, when studied the traditional ecological knowledge, they have identified the character that it is dissimilar to science. So where scientific knowledge is characterized by such terms as generalized, universal, formal, and systematic, indigenous knowledge is local, and it is a non-generalized, and it is non-systematic and informal knowledge. Okay, there is no formal medium, like I am giving you a training through this medium, and IGNU has published books regarding the various courses. So this is again a formal and systematic way of teaching, but indigenous knowledge is not that formal system. And if you're getting information about indigenous knowledge through this system, this is only through some examples or through some context. But if you want to gain deeper indigenous knowledge about a special aspect, you have to go there, you have to live there, you have to experience it, you have to maybe catch fish with those fishermen to get an idea what kind of knowledge they have. Because even those people, they are not able to decipher what kind of concepts are involved in the knowledge system they are imbibing. Again, it has shown that all the knowledge is sociologically constructed, and the body of knowledge, including the Western scientific knowledge, is not completely value free. So if we feel that this is the idea of Fleck, and the study of Fleck in 1979, he thought that this mode of thinking that shows a Western scientific knowledge as non-culturally biased is completely wrong. So he has proven that even the Western science has some values in it, and it is also culturally biased. So these are the larger differences in scientific and indigenous knowledge we have studied so far. Scientific knowledge is, it is basically summarizing what we have already learned through this lecture. It is scientific knowledge is ever expanding and indigenous knowledge is static. So scientific knowledge is structured and clear, and indigenous knowledge is non-structured and has a disuse and fuzzy character. And scientific knowledge is generalized, universal, formal, systematic, while indigenous knowledge is socio-culturally constructed. Now, the goal is not to identify difference between the two. The goal of this study and the goal of this lecture is to identify how we can integrate both of them in a way that all forms of knowledge are socially constructed and they can serve to fulfill our goals of sustainable development, natural resource conservation, as well as economic development, okay, in a balanced manner. Again, we have ethnoscience. Now, ethnoscience, this is a word coined by anthropologists who tried to show the efficacy of tribal forms of knowledge and the rational basis of this kind of knowledge. So debate is whether indigenous knowledge is a science or not, whether we should shift toward the perfect science or whether we should go for the completely scientific knowledge. That was the debate earlier. But now the debate has changed. Now our focus is to converge both the kind of sciences, and so that we can continue towards our path of sustainable development. So ethnoscience was again criticized by Paulson and Latour, and Latour is a scientist who has worked a lot on indigenous knowledge systems, and he has studied how the way human societies are dichotomizing into us and them, that we are us, scientific community is us, and indigenous knowledge is them. So they are creating that kind of difference, and that kind of difference should not be there. And again, Chris Shore in 1996, he has distinguished between the two ways of knowing, like analytical and non-analytical. So analytical is basically yes or no. Either it can be this way or it can be those way. But non-analytical can be in a kind of analog codes. It can be in a terms of associations, in kind of different kind of impacts which can be created by number of components. It cannot be just one or two, yes or no. Okay. So this, the work of Latour has gained insight into the objects and facts constructed by human beings, and he has given collective term that which refers to the associations of humans and non-humans, basically abiotic and biotic components, which we refer to these days. So he termed as these non-humans as actants, and these are represented by a spokesperson that is representative of the knowledge. So there is some representative in a community which is acting as an actant, and that spokesperson gives you collective form of the knowledge about the humans as well as the non-humans components of an ecosystem. So in any indigenous knowledge based area or any system, you have to identify who is the actant. And the difference between the local knowledge and science lies in the size of the collective number of actants. So if there are more number of actants, and they are the difference between the local knowledge and science will be lesser. Okay, so even if there are few people who are aware about the local knowledge, the difference will be higher. So more and more deep and ingrained system is there, more and more people are aware about those concepts. So it will kind of establish itself as a science in that area. So more people are aware, and the more knowledge will be there, the more powerful it becomes, and more it enables to be taught to other communities in the area, as well as to our next generations or the students or the children in that community. And it becomes a kind of science when it is culturally so ingrained and transferred from generation to generation. So thus, in technoscience, the range of inscription is very large, and everything can be moved to and fro by the process of inscription. So the inscription itself entails the externalization. For example, if I want to give you some knowledge, if I'm giving you this presentation, even if you don't understand some concept, you can go back and forth and go through these concepts again and again imbibe those knowledge systems, or imbibe those concepts which I'm telling you. So, but if it is only verbal, or if it is only through my actions or through my activities, then you have to be with me, to observe me, to experience what I am doing, and then imbibe from it. So that will be not that much transferable as compared to what is spoken, written, printed, and then transferred. Okay. So thus, oral traditions as a form of inscription cannot travel very far. Okay. So if any of you have any kind of question, you can please write it down and we'll take up those questions at the end of the lecture. So thus, there are differences between knowledge is not in their efficient or applicability or truth, but in the range of externalization, how it can be traveled, how it can go from one place to other, one person to other, one scientific community to another. So as long as it can be transferred again and again, as long as it can be replicated again and again, same results can be obtained again and again, then it establishes itself as a scientific knowledge. So again, this is example I referred to in earlier slide. So now we'll discuss it in detail. Like in fishing, also in Black Sea, traditional fishermen are described by Knudsen, and they have groups in small boats, and they have knowledge of the ocean bottom also. So when like they have even a sonar display when there will be some stars will be in this location, what will be the location of moon, how much will be the rise in the tide, and how much will be the multiplication of the fish in some area of sea bottom. Though those kind of ingrained knowledge and those kind of detailed knowledge about the fishing concepts is there in the traditional fishermen of Black Sea. So they have this kind of indigenous knowledge system, IKS we are talking about. So even the captains of large ships, they take these fishermen along with them so that they can interpret those sonar signals, and they can identify what is the emergency situation that is going to come, or what kind of rise in tide will be there, if some kind of hurricane is going to come up, some kind of storm is going to come up. So if this kind of appreciation is there by even the captains of large ships, that means that these people are already establishing themselves as a scientific community in their local sense. So the small boat fishers again have the knowledge about the addas that are perceived as flat fishing banks. Like at the bottom of the sea, there is a large area which is flat, and there are large number of fish which are thriving there, which are nesting there, which have their eggs laid in those areas. So the density of population of fish in that area will be very large. So these people who have knowledge about these flat fishing banks, they can easily capture a large stock of fish for their production and for their commercialization. Again, they maintain the balance so that they can continue getting the fish in future as well. So the local fishermen know by experience that whiting and turbot are more frequently to be found in other addas, and what kind of fish is there. And this kind of knowledge is not inscribed by these fishers, but they share a routine by practice, and that is not even verbalized. So when they practice that routine every day, and the people who are in that community or going there for fishing every day, they kind of imbibe those practices. Okay. So again, they have the symbols. They have symbols like they have. They also know about imagination of the fisher, about how the sea bottom looks like. If you tell them, ask them how to draw these shores and to show them diagrammatically and how they can symbolize that, only do it through hand symbolism. I request all the participants to kindly mute themselves so that there's no disturbance. So how to assess indigenous knowledge and local knowledge when this is not transferable, it is not inscribed. So there is general opinion regarding this, that this knowledge is not accessible to large masses. Okay, so on the basis of studies of Latour, this type of knowledge is different from scientific knowledge. But again, there have been few scientists like Andrew Vadya is there in 2004, and she started to study these indigenous knowledge system, and she has identified few techniques how these systems can be studied and how information can be taken from these studies. So first step is to examine the actions. Okay, what they are doing. Like I am telling you again and again, if you want to learn from them, you have to experience the situation, you have to experience the local conditions, you have to go with them, you have to take part in the activities they are doing, and then only you will be able to imbibe that in IKS. So what knowledge these actions are based on is so far as these actions rather than any other action. So this is the second step, to identify what is the knowledge system locally imbibed. Then what are the causes of change in these actions and what is their knowledge basis? That is the step 3. So if these 3 steps are followed, we can decode any indigenous knowledge system in any place, and we can take advantage of that IKS in supporting our own scientific knowledge, and then devising some strategy for the conservation of natural resource in that area. So as it is mostly understood that external interest in both actions and knowledge is linked to the success in devising the programs. Okay, so we have to take care of the holistic studies of cultures so that the embedded knowledge system is there, can be studied and ingrained into our system. Okay, and there is one specific way of doing this. This is rapid rural appraisal studies, RRAs. And we often conduct RRAs whenever we go for any international project, internationally funded projects like from ADB or World Bank or Japan International Funding Agency or DANIDA, Danish International Funding Agency. So all these funding agencies have a mandate that before you implement any kind of project, you have to do initial environment examination. You have to take care of the indigenous systems. You have to take care of the indigenous peoples, women empowerment, gender mainstreaming. So, and while doing these kind of studies before the project starts, you take up strategies like RRAs. The RRA is basically a tool. Okay, so when you go for RRA, you identify at the outset what is the certain environment related or resource related action which are taken in these areas. Okay, and which have direct relevance for actions directed towards sustainability. That is the first step of RRA. Then you study only those knowledge systems that are relevant for the goals of sustainability. First, you identify all the environment related or resource related actions. For example, if they are going for getting wood or fuel wood in the evening, if they are going to harvest trees in a specific season, or they are harvesting crops in other season, if they are going to collect water from river, from pond, from well. So all environment related or resource related actions are listed down. Then only those knowledge, studying only those knowledge that are relevant for the goals of sustainability. For example, I'll provide them LPG or some other fuel source rather than asking them to be dependent on the local fuel wood, so that I can stop the deforestation or overgrazing in that area. then there is need to study the entire knowledge system and cultural relevance. So what is the cultural relevance of their activity or actions? Then last step is to assume that all practices and knowledge systems are embedded in cultural matrices. So this kind of stepwise study is done during rapid rural appraisal, and sometimes we make them sit in a group and with all the stakeholders in a room, maybe in a panchayat room or in a government school building or in a government school playground. We ask them to sit, all the stakeholders with our project team, and then we draw a picture of their village and ask them to identify what are the different activities at different locations which they are doing. For example, if they are going to take their cattle or livestock for grazing at some location, we'll draw that, so that they themselves tell us what kind of activities are natural resource oriented and natural resource driven, which they take up in their daily lives. And those activities should not be hampered when the project takes up. So they should be sustainable in themselves. And if they cannot be sustainable, we devise some strategies to tell them how they can make it sustainable. Okay. So again, Andrew Vaidya also carried out investigations in farmers' practice of pest management in Indonesia. So she realized that farmers use traditional knowledge and how they responded to scientific knowledge about scientific training about the pest management. So they were better. The knowledge imparted to the farmers about pest management was about the interactions between the pest and the predators, and how the differential impact of various pests at various stages of the life cycle can create dangers for their crops in at various life cycles of their crops, and how there can be resurgence of the pest and how they can stop that. So after carefully devising a strategy to tell them about the pest management, they were able to tell the farmers to take up these kind of initiatives. Then the farmers walk through the fields and usually near the edges, and they used to look out the visible pest so that they can be aware about what kind of pests are multiplying in that area. So earlier they were never taught about these kind of predators and pests. So the interesting observation made was that there indeed were farmers who could and did learn sampling rules and counting procedures. Okay, so they were able to count the number of pests and at which threshold level they will start multiplying at a faster rate, which can create a major risk for their crop. Okay. These are again some of the examples related with pest management only. And again, there were other investigations done in the Philippines and by other people, like in mangrove plantation, which was earlier a private and household affair, and how the people were taught that they can earlier people used to think there is no knowledge involved. Okay, so then they were taught about what kind of knowledge is involved and how they can do mangrove planting and how they can utilize these mangrove plantations commercially for their economic benefit. Okay, similar was the case with study of Weddell in 1972, where shifting cultivators in New Guinea shows that planting sweet potatoes on mounds can be helpful. Okay. So in our, when we consider about the intellectual property rights, so the intellectual property rights refer to the claim that one can legitimately occupy any piece of creative work. Okay, for example, I am making Punjabi juttis and I have a skill of making Punjabi juttis for many generations. So I can get it patented and I can get it restored as IPR of my community. Okay, intellectual property rights can be gained by my community over that product. So similarly, if you have any kind of information, So earlier it was thought that it can be linked with only a kind of product which physically exists. But now intellectual property rights are there, which can be for any kind of creative work or discovery or a knowledge that has that one has prior to anyone else. Okay, so if subak plantation of Indonesia is being done only in Indonesia and the community living there, they can get the IPR rights over that kind of technology. Okay, so while it is easier ascribed in the modern times when people are aware of the legalities of ownership, it is difficult to introduce such rights to people who are indigenous. Okay, who where traditionally rights of user rather than rights of the possessor were in place. So it is very difficult to tell people who are having indigenous knowledge system. This is the major drawback or major hurdle we face when we go for IPR rights of indigenous people, because again these people are not aware about IPR, then they are not even aware about how they should go for IPR and why they should go. The first question is, why do we need it? So like in the case of Enga cited above, may be attributed to the ancestors or maybe not be recognized as knowledge. But for example, the Filipino thought that planting mangrove forest required no special skill or knowledge. So for them, they neither consider it as a specialized knowledge, nor a skill, nor a piece of creative knowledge which can go for IPR. So that is a major hurdle, and these rights to traditional people were thus often usurped by the outsiders, and they gained patents and issued on certain herbs or natural products. There are many examples where people coming from outside communities, they are gaining IPR rights on certain herbs or natural products which are locally found. So IPR came into picture to identify like which people actually have the rights on these kind of skills and knowledge systems. So for example, in India also infringements of traditional rights have been observed for basmati rice and herbal products based on neem, so which were part of the Indian traditional ecological knowledge. Okay, so they should not be utilized by some outside agents. So if some outside agent is utilizing that knowledge, it's high time that you take care of those knowledge system and you get them, you get their IPR rights rather than some external agency is going to take benefit out of it. So even the churches in many regions, they are becoming more sensitive to people's rights, and they have incorporated indigenous cosmologies and practices in their preaching. Okay, so even the church systems in many places, for example, in Philippines, they have identified how to get these practices and preaching in their rights. So the Native Americans, they have been fighting through their grassroots organizations for proposing innovative, sustainable, indigenous alternatives. Okay, so there are many examples where intellectual property rights are now coming to rescue of these people, and they have identified how these knowledge systems in, for example, in Native Americans, they have guided by their natural law how they can take care of their indigenous knowledge systems. Okay. So this is again an example of shamans community. So these are healers. So the healing system or the knowledge of healing a body, that is also there in India also. In many people they have these healing capacities, and they are called healers in traditional sense, but they believe that when they are going to charge money for their knowledge, that the supernatural agency or the powers given to them by the supernatural god or any other body which they preserve and which they respect is going to withdraw that knowledge from them if they are going to charge money for their skill. So this knowledge is seen as a gift. Okay, but definitely you can get your IPR rights for that kind of knowledge so that no other person can take benefit of that knowledge. Then some shamans of Mazatecs of southern Mexico, they with plant spirits in order to heal on a part of the being a healer. So they, through plants, they tell you what kind of problem you are having, and plant spirits, they use plant spirits to heal your body and to heal any kind of health implication you are having. Then there are Kayapos of Brazil. Okay, these are not Indians, these are Brazilians, but the name is like that, Kayopo Indians of Brazil. So they believe that health and well-being of humans depend upon plants, animals, and forces of nature. So thus it is very difficult or impossible to assign IPR to individuals in such traditional knowledge systems. And the only international body that is taking care of such knowledge system is International Labour Organization, ILO. So that this body is only legally binding international organization to protect the rights of indigenous and tribal people. And that is the reason whenever we take up any kind of international project, we have a mandate to take care of the indigenous people in that area living in our project site, or in the 500-meter or 10-kilometer of our project site. So because all international funding agencies are again abiding by the rules and regulations of ILO. Okay. So these are the references of some of the studies which I have discussed and referred to, and you can always go to them, study them in detail. So thank you. Last, I'll quote this UNEP administrator's comment that nature-based solutions for climate are one of the most cost-effective approaches we have for achieving our climate goals. So they also provide multiple co-benefits for achieving the sustainable development goals. And investing in nature is not only the smart thing to do, it is the right thing to do, because it will help you in getting ecological efficiency as well as economic efficiency. And when you imbibe indigenous knowledge systems into achieving these sustainable development goals, the target becomes much easier. Thank you. So now if any one of you have any questions,